Start real quick, just a few housekeeping items, so then we can start right on time at 12 o'clock. So we certainly appreciate you joining us today for our bi-monthly meeting. As you know, we're still continuing in these webinar events, but I'm super glad that we're still able to meet. A few things that I wanted to point out. We have some amazing speakers that we are lining up for the remainder of the year, but we really want to hear from you guys to know what are the topics that you're most interested in. So thanks to Brad Patrick actually for helping us out with Jen here today and a few others. We want to make sure that we're serving you with the best content. So feel free to put a note in the chat if you want to do that right now, or if you want to email us, or definitely put it on the survey after today's meeting. Any of those would be perfect, because we just want to make sure that we're continuing to have the content that you want for these meetings moving forward. So without further ado, we do have Jenn Mart here today, who is the Director of Global Benefits for Valvoline here in Lexington. She is going to talk to us about the PTO transformation that they have made at Valvoline. And as we all know, they are quite large of an employer. So if Valvoline can do it, I'm sure the rest of us can. So Jenn, I will turn it over to you and let you get started.
Hey, that sounds great. And Meredith did let me know that most of you are based in the Lexington area or the surrounding area of Lexington. But what I first thought I'd do is kind of just start with a summary of how Valvoline got to where we are today, because it makes a difference in our discussion about PTO. And so Valvoline, of course, now is a publicly traded company since 2016, when we separated from our prior parent, Ashland Inc. But that said, we have been in the lubricant business for over 150 years. And the reason this is important in the context of our paid time off discussion is when we separated from Ashland, we really did what I call the copy paste. You know, if you think about copy paste in Excel, we basically lifted all of their policies and shifted them to Valvoline, meaning that the vacation policy that we inherited at the time had been in place for many, many years. And it was always sort of the proverbial HR joke, like, is anyone going to touch this policy? And so luckily, we were able to touch it for January 1st of this year. And that's what we'll walk through today, is really how we got there. If we think about our employees, though, and who this impacted, right now we are 10,000 employees strong globally in about 140 countries. Of that 10,000 number, 1,000 of those employees do sit internationally, so weren't impacted by this change because we mostly focus on US and Canada. But we do have a lot of segments of our population, including those corporate folks that sit here in our Lexington-based headquarters. We have those instant oil change centers where hopefully all of you are wonderfully serviced on your cars for your quick lube oil change. And that is 80% of our US employees. So 80% of that number does work in one of those instant oil change retail locations. And also really important when we talk in the context of PTO and how we ultimately designed the program for them as well. We do think we have a strong value proposition. So maybe you know someone that works with Valvoline, and hopefully they feel this too, that it all starts with our people, and we provide hands-on expertise, which ultimately leads to that family-friendly culture, which is service-driven, product-fueled, and technology-enabled. The other piece that I think is helpful in the context of the PTO discussion is our overall strategy. And our strategy has been in place since really we became Valvoline, and it hasn't changed. We just keep aligning our benefit programs, our compensation programs, to our overall total reward strategy, which I won't read all of this, but really is to target that 50th percentile, or really our median of our peers, or slightly above, in all of the labor markets in which we do business. So that was an important one as we discussed moving our vacation plan to a PTO plan. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, what does paid time off mean for Valvoline? And so we previously had vacation days, sick days, and floating holidays. So 3 distinct buckets of time. Those are the buckets of time, though, that we wrapped up into paid time off. So no longer is it, do I take a vacation day or do I take a sick day for a personal illness? But what do I do if my dependent's sick? When do I use my floating holidays? Are those paid out? All of those questions were really simplified by moving to a paid time off program. And what we did note here, we didn't change our company designated holidays. So while we wrapped up everything into this nice paid time off bucket, there was no change to that company holiday. So for the purpose of our discussion, that piece was really not touched for this year. All right, so that's sort of the background. We got to here we are at Valvoline. We have these Ashland policies for vacation. What do we do with it as we're moving to paid time off, and how did we get there? So this next slide is really busy, but we're going to walk through each of these steps because I think it'll be helpful context for you, not only if you're looking to revamp your paid time off policies, but really if you're just looking to go through a big change management exercise within your organization. So the first is really determining our why. So we mentioned that Valvoline became its own publicly traded company, and we said, okay, let's review all of those programs. We did that around 2018, 2019. And we really noticed that our vacation and sick policies had fallen below benchmark, which made it challenging, as you can imagine, to recruit and hire new employees that maybe had more generous benefits at the organizations they were leaving. Also, when we looked at our levels at director and above, it wasn't competitive, and it required things like administrative leave, which was our solution for these employees to grant either an additional week or 2 weeks worth of time. And that would allow them to have that additional time until they met up with our vacation policy based on tenure with the organization. And when we ended up transitioning, that meant over 150 people had these administrative leaves granted to them when they first signed on board. That, and we'll discuss what we did with those as we moved forward. But it really created inequities. Like even if I looked, and we did this for a few groups, if I looked at a group that had 5 people at the same grade level, all with less than 5 years of service, 2 may have admin leave and 3 did not. And they're all at the same grade. They had the same prior type of experience, but you can see how that really created inequities in our administration and sort of the haves and have-nots when it came to administrative leave. Now, maybe you have something similar. That time is not paid out on termination, so that's why it ended up with a different name for Valvoline as opposed to just additional vacation time. Ultimately, these 2 bullet points aren't in line with that total rewards philosophy, that philosophy of creating benefits at or above benchmark, of providing inclusive benefits that help attract and retain talent. So we took this sort of background and we decided on some pillars of what we wanted to do and why move to paid time off. So part of that was adding simplification. And so by combining those 3 buckets worth of time, it's no longer confusing to the employees of what to use time and when, and it also eases our administration significantly. It's also flexible, right? Because by adding time to paid time off, they can use that time however, whenever, and your conversation with your manager changes. I need to take a paid time off day, as opposed to, well, I'm sort of feeling under the weather. I think this is a sick day versus vacation. Overall, it's simple and it's flexible. We also knew that this would help our compliance. And as you all know, there are over 200 now state and municipal labor laws that relate to either paid time off or sick leaves. And so while we won't go into how we fix that through our compliance during this discussion today, it was also an important pillar of why we wanted to move to paid time off. And last but certainly not least is savings. And this is an important concept for us because under our old policy, vacation was granted on the first of the year, meaning if I had 4 weeks of vacation time and I wanted to leave on January 2nd, I would get paid out for my 4 weeks of vacation time. By switching to prospective accruals, meaning that I'm going to accrue my paid time off throughout the year and ultimately earn my PTO throughout the year, we were able to recognize a one-time financial gain by not having to have that large accrual on our balance sheet of $13 million. So we knew that ahead of time, motivating factor. We ended up realizing it last year. There's also an ongoing savings because in that example, if I left on January 2nd, I would have received all of my vacation pay for that year. And so we're realizing termination pay savings since we're earning our time throughout the year. So those 4 pillars were really compelling reasons of why we wanted to move to PTO. So establishing our why, really key step so that we could work on our next step, which is engaging our executive sponsors. And this is really a key lesson learned because we attempted, as we discussed, we looked at this in 18 and 19, and we didn't have those executive champions, those voices, that buy-in to really start to launch that program for 1/1 of 2020. That was our original goal, is to say, why couldn't we do this in 2020 as opposed to now in 2021? Now, in the value of hindsight, that did allow us to get smarter and more prepared so that we had all of 2020 to prepare us for the change in 2021. We also chose sponsors that could really help us move this discussion forward. And so not surprisingly, our Chief People Officer was one of those executive sponsors, but maybe one you wouldn't always expect was our Chief Financial Officer as well. And while that savings price tag that we discussed previously was a motivating factor, she's overall a great champion for our employees and a voice for change to help move that forward for the organization. So far, we've decided our why, we've gathered those executive sponsors, and then we got busy in the details of drafting our new design. And for our discussion, how we ended up at this design isn't as important as really what we did to get here. So, and you can see here, we listed the previous program, we've listed the new paid time off program, but thorough benchmarking went into all these figures. So that's benchmarking from Willis Towers Watson, from Mercer, from Korn Ferry, to make sure that we were falling in line with our total rewards philosophy when we came up with this new program. What I can spend some time doing is just maybe highlighting some of the questions we later received about this design, because this draft design pretty much carried us forward all the way until this year. We didn't really make many tweaks or challenges from when we first drafted the design, which is why I put this so early in the process as we move forward. But fundamentally, how this worked for us, I've been with Valvoline now 9 years, so I fall in this 5 to 9 year bucket, which means under my old program, I had 15 days of vacation, plus I had 3 floating holidays and 10 sick days. So those are those 3 buckets of time that we talked about. Now, if we fast forward to this year, that equates to 25 days of paid time off. And so what people often did is they said, well, if I take my 15 days plus my 3 floating holidays plus my 10 sick days, that equals 28 days. Why are you only giving me 25? And what we spent a lot of time educating is the power of a sick day compared to a paid time off day is not the same. I can use my PTO for whatever I want, as opposed to a sick day, which was for personal illness or injury. That, in addition to our short-term disability benefit, really enabled, like if I went out for a surgery, I still have that pay protection available to me if I needed to be out for an extended amount of time. So I didn't necessarily need that many sick days when it equated to paid time off. Other cool features that we were able to add, we enhanced our parental leave. Previously, we had parental leave of 2 weeks. We changed that to paid family leave, and you can see that now that's 4 weeks of paid time off. So in addition to your bonding time for, let's say, a new baby or an adopted child, you now can also use that time to care for an ill family member with a serious health condition. The other pieces that people really liked, the idea of carryover. Our old policy was use it or lose it. Now with paid time off, we're able to add that feature of carrying over 1 week of time to use in the first quarter of the next year. And also a concept with paid time off, since we're accruing on a per paycheck basis, we had to determine how many days we would allow people to advance before they were earned. And so in this case, it was 2 weeks worth of time. Meaning if I wanted to take a 2-week vacation on January 3rd of the new year, I could still do that by borrowing against my bank of time, and then my paycheck would replenish those hours throughout the year. Another key piece of this, and you see the small asterisk here, it is that our director level and above, remember we discussed that was a hard talent pool for us to recruit to. We helped solve a little bit for that in this policy by anyone at that level of director and above receives 25 days with less than 5 years of service. Now, we mentioned there was retail. So if any of you have retail locations, we also had to consider that design. And so we call that group our Valvoline Instant Oil Change hourly population, and their program is slightly different. But ultimately, great highlights and great story to tell for this group by moving to paid time off, particularly if someone had worked in our stores previously, they didn't get any vacation until they reached 1 year of service. So that meant even for our store managers who are putting in all that time that are enabling us currently to work from home and be successful, didn't have any vacation time. And so now we've moved to paid time off, and they start earning that time right away, and they can use that time after 90 days of employment. Their schedule is also a little different than ours when it comes to paid time off. They didn't have quite the same sick policy that we did before, and this really fell within our benchmark as far as where we wanted to be as an organization going forward that would sustain us into the future. Another perk you'll see on here is short-term disability. Previously, we did not offer that benefit to our retail centers, and we added that for this year. We designed it pretty uniquely so that because of our turnover in those retail centers, that benefit in the first year of service is less than once they're employed with us for more than a year. So they get 60% of pay in that first year of service, and then there's 100% pay benefit if they're there for over a year. They also had that parental leave before, but changing that to paid family leave, another attractive benefit for our retail centers. So just some key highlights of, really how we started to think about this, how we benchmarked it, because we wanted to come up with how that design would look going forward. But there were some key grandfathering considerations for a change like this, and identifying these early in our process helped frame a lot of that conversation. So it's really, what did we do with all that sick time? Previously, we had some employees that had 52 weeks of sick pay. So that would be 26 weeks of 100% pay, and then some at 60% pay. What do we do with these large accumulated balances? What we proposed and what we ended up implementing was that they can use that during their waiting period for short-term disability, and they could also use it in lieu of reduced pay of short-term disability, meaning that if you were going to go down to a 75% short-term disability pay benefit, you could use that grandfathered sick time instead. We also had to consider our long tenured employees. If you may have noticed in the design slide, we did not provide a benefit, an additional benefit, once you reach 30 years of service. And that was intentional based on benchmark, what we're seeing in other companies. But we do have some people in that group that previously would have received additional benefit at 30 years. We recommended and ended up adopting the new program for that group with really no grandfathering consideration. As we mentioned, there was some administrative leave. That was that time given to people that negotiated it when they first came in, those over 150 people, and we ended up sunsetting those admin days. And I have to tell you, in hindsight, that was one of the harder changes for people. We ended up talking to a lot of those people that felt that they had really negotiated that during their hire. And it's one that we've held firm to, meaning even new hires this year, there's no additional consideration given now that our policy is market competitive, and we've offered additional compensation this year in that form of PTO. So big decision there, and the grandfathering considerations that we went through in our initial design. So we've so far, we determined our why, we got those executive sponsors engaged, we drafted the design, and we used that design to get the voice of our employees. And we did that through some listening sessions over Microsoft Teams. And the pandemic really led into doing this over Teams, and our goal was to gather feedback on the proposal and then refine the program. So we solicited the help of our HR business partners, and we identified over 100 employees in the groups that you see here on this slide. And this was really another lesson learned to make sure that we got a diverse group of people, that we held those sessions to make sure we gathered that feedback. And while it didn't change our ultimate design, what it really changed was how we communicated the program. But we did hold those very similar to what you would any listening session. You know, people shared their videos. We made sure that all voices were heard. We showed everyone the courtesy and respect, and ended up gathering some really great feedback from our employees. And we sort of bucketed these feedback into really positive, neutral, or maybe perceived the change negatively. And in the positive group, we saw a lot of our quick lubes, our oil change locations, overwhelmingly positive. They liked some of the key features. A lot of our employees received the change very positively in these sessions. The managers were really more neutral. So that would be if they were based here or throughout the country. And I would bubble that down to really they were concerned about the change management, the concerned about how their employees would react, how we would communicate it. And so that fed our communications as we discussed. On the more hesitant side, our plant managers, and we do have several plant facilities throughout the US, were very concerned. And so we knew going into it that we would have to pay special attention to those locations so that we could communicate it and address those questions or uncertainties. And a lot of that related to long tenured employees who were concerned about that sick balance that they had accumulated. They were concerned about that 30 years of service mark. And so again, we knew we really had to communicate to that group. So when we moved forward, we said, we listened, and then what are we going to do? We're going to communicate in all sorts of different ways. And that involved being really intentional about how we communicated to everyone. And so here's a version of kind of how we viewed that timeline, and more just to highlight to you that we started early. So we started communicating this change in August of last year in preparation for January 1st. And we did that by emailing our managers, then engaging our employees. But also, and the piece that was sort of a game changer for us was personalized mailers to all US and Canadian employees that were on board as of June 30th to let them know how the program impacted them directly. Then we held our information sessions that included individual sessions for all of our plant locations to address the earlier concern from that listening session. And we even did a plant session in person, of course, very safely, but our plants have been in operation. So I was able to go to one of the local plant locations to deliver that message as well. And that was helpful to gauge what sort of questions would happen in all of the other sessions going forward. We had great FAQs posted. We sent reminders, we sent postcard reminders, and then launched the program on January 1st. We even followed it up with a Yam Jam. And if you're not familiar with that term, if you have the service yammer, that's basically when you give people a time to go on and they can ask you any question real time. So almost like if we were all on Facebook at the same time asking questions. To give you kind of a snapshot of what those individual communications looked like, here's an example of one of the letters. And in addition to a summary page with the program changes, inside the packet basically described what they had previously and what they'll have going forward under the new paid time off program. And again, sent those individual mailers to everyone in the US and Canada. We also have a microsite, which is basically just a website we host that has benefit information. And we posted our FAQs out there, which was really helpful if we needed to update something and provide that real time. So you can see a snapshot of that as well, and it helped serve in the communication message. So now that we've communicated it, really what do you do? And that's just implement your program. And so when we looked at the program implementation, what I would encourage you if you're going through a change similar to this is to not underestimate the time that this would take in implementing it into your timekeeping system and ensuring that you have the appropriate resources to implement the change. I know at Valvoline that timekeeping system doesn't fall under benefits, so we had to rely heavily on our HRIS resources to help us with the change. And so that is one that definitely is not worth missing. We also, as I mentioned, continued to update our resources and our FAQs, and then follow that up with recognition just to the team in general for all their accomplishments, because it is a big change and it took a toll on our people implementing it. And I know everyone sort of breathes a sigh of relief when we hit January 1st, but that didn't mean the questions stopped. So we can continue to see questions through most of January, and then and seeking that feedback with all of our employees, key stakeholders, and our executive sponsors. So really, if I left you with some takeaways, if you're considering a change like this, and even if it's not related to paying time off, it's really to plan early. And as you saw from kind of our initial failures, if you will, We did not anticipate it early enough to get it done for 2020, but that gave us the ability to implement it for January 1st of 2021. And that executive sponsorship really helped and made sure that we were all driving to the common goal. Make sure you do all that research, align it to your philosophy on total rewards or benefits or your employee value proposition. Benchmark it with key partners and even get their feedback. We shared our program with even these partners after looking at their benchmarking to see what we might be missing. And then really personalizing those communications was, I think, the thing that set us over the edge, really helped us get to the finish line, because time off in particular impacts each person really differently. For me, I know I perceive this as a very positive change. This helps me and my family life by adding that additional paid time off, that flexibility, but not everyone was going to be on the same positive spin with this. So by providing those communications, we could let people see the value in the program as it relates to their individual circumstances. And with that, that's really the key takeaways. That's really how we got here and what I wanted to share with you. And I know we have some more time for questions, so I'm happy to go back over any of that in more detail if it's helpful, and also just really open it up to questions if there's any. And I know I saw one in the chat from Tina, so I don't know if you want to kind of elaborate on that more, but she was talking more about the remote work and the wage and hour compliance update. Oh, and that might have been for an idea going forward.
Yeah, I think that was her idea for a topic. So I have a question, and I think you said this, but just maybe you could elaborate. So we have some folks, because we have kind of the same thing that you guys had before with the sick and vacation buckets, but we have some folks with over 200 days of sick time. Did you have that much of accrued sick time? And if you did, can you maybe re-explain how you folded that into the program?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And we did. So the most sick time someone could have is actually a year. So 365 days. So there are some people that are sitting out there with a full year worth of sick time, which is crazy to me now that we have short-term disability and long-term disability, right? Because they're not exactly using it for anything but incidental days. And that's actually how our short-term disability program is, that after that week period, you would use short-term disability pay. But what we did, we froze it. So it still sits in our system. So I can still see the amount of time I have available to me. But we basically just said it's out there just so that you can top off short-term disability. Meaning I apply for short-term disability. If I'm approved for short-term disability, then that first week can be sick pay. And we did this with a lot of like charts to people because it took a little bit to set in. Then my short-term disability would pay until I'd get to a point where my short-term disability would be reduced. And then I could also just use my sick time instead. So one of the questions we got was, well, will you just top up the time? Like if STD is 75%, do I just use 25% of vacation? And we decided no in our program. That's just administratively complex. And if you're sitting on 52 weeks of time, you'll never spend that balance down. Right. And that's sort of our hope, is that you fast forward 5 years from now and you say, only 20 people dipped into that, or whatever it is at that point, to say, we still have these large balances. They're not really being used. At that point, can you make that frozen balance go away? Although it's not hurting anyone, right? It just sits out there for an approved claim. Employees can't enter that time either, which helps. So they're not just using that incrementally to get paid. So that's sort of what we decided to do with them. And it made people feel better that it wasn't a takeaway. And I don't know if all of yours are 100% days, but we also had that 60% pay sick benefit. And those are interesting because short-term disability for us is a greater benefit than 60% pay. So arguably we could have said, oh, those go away now that you don't need them. But we just left them there because it gave people a better sense of ease. Just to have
So if someone leaves with that frozen balance that they haven't touched, are they paid out anything?
They aren't at Valvoline, and they never were. So okay. They just are sitting there. So that piece was easier not to have to change.
Right. Certainly, you guys are more than welcome to unmute your lines and ask away, because I know this is a topic that we've looked at. One other question, I'm curious, how did you get your executive sponsors? Because the two folks that you saw that sponsored your program are some of the two on our team that we have the most naysayers from. So, and because some of those people are the ones that have 300 sick days accrued. So I'm curious, was there anything specific that you did to persuade them, or not really persuade them, but probably just to educate them so they could be a champion for the program?
Yeah, I think the thing that helps with both of those individuals are they are less tenured. So they don't have those long, kind of not long-lived ideals, but long-lived with the company, right? Of this is what people earned. And that was a lot of the discussion. I earned this, you're taking away my earned benefit. I said, no, I'm not, I'm freezing it. But that helped. The second piece, the financial impact, was really compelling for Valvoline. So that helped Mary really get on board. And that's sort of what we come back to, right? That it was almost expected of HR to make sure we got it done so that we could realize that savings figure. And so I think that helps from a finance discussion. And but there are certainly among our leadership team other naysayers that have been here longer term, right? And that's sort of your obstacle to overcome, to say, hey, here's all the benefits in addition to the financial impact. If we're trying to attract and retain the best talent, this is the kind of way people are going. So if you looked at the marketplace, like offering 4 weeks of paid time off is much more compelling than 2 weeks of vacation. So it's sort of having the same discussion over and over and over again. So you're like blue in the face. But I mean, our first discussion started in probably March of last year, right? Giving us like plenty of time to get that backing from everyone.
Okay. And we do have a question about, is your short-term and long-term disability self-funded or through another company?
It's a great question. Our short-term disability is self-funded. So we do have a company that helps facilitate the leave program. So that's Lincoln Financial currently. So they provide us advice to pay on short-term. Long-term disability, luckily, is insured after a certain point. So there is a legacy group of people that have been on long-term disability since before, oh geez, forget the date, 2011, that are out there, but otherwise it's an insured benefit.
Okay. Good questions. Do you guys have any others? You're welcome to put them in the chat, or you can certainly speak up if you have questions for Jenn.
I'd like to know, for a newer company or a startup, what are the top things you think should be considered when creating a vacation policy or PTO policy from scratch?
That's a great question. And, you know, I would start by saying I would recommend a paid time off program, mainly because by accruing on a per paycheck basis, you're not going to get to that accumulation on the balance sheet of all of that time that you might have to pay people if they terminate. So that's the first piece. And the second piece is really what your overall philosophy is. The things we just discussed before landing on this design, things like unlimited PTO, does that fit for your population? And we weren't ready for that yet. So I know there are some organizations in Lexington that are, and they implement that, and it works well for them. But for us, we just weren't ready. So that's another consideration, is even if you put as many guidelines on it. The other criteria is what all you include in it. I like that our paid time off is everything but company paid holidays. And so we do have 9 of those days that are designated in addition to paid time off. And then really it's your leave programs that help supplement it. So I'd say those are the other items. It would be paid time off for the flexibility. It would be your holiday discussion, determine if unlimited works for you, and then how do you supplement that with the rest of your leave program.
Great, thank you.
Absolutely.
Who was responsible for ensuring that in your old system that sick time was actually used for sick related days? Was that something at the supervisor level, or was it something managed higher up by HR or payroll?
Under our old program, that would have been your manager. Your manager would have been signing off on time. If you were going to be out greater than the 5-day waiting period, they would direct you to file a short-term disability claim so that that time could be approved. Now, that said, we still had to do a lot of audits, right? Because some people would just continuously add that sick time and not be on an approved leave, which is of course important for all of us to make sure they're filing for their FMLA, to make sure that they have that job protection, etc. But very loose monitoring, I would say. We tried to implement as many of those controls as possible, but very challenging in comparison to where we've gotten now. But great question.
Yeah, that's a tricky one for us too. It's hard to manage. So we have another question. How does your vacation buy/sell program work?
Oh, that's a good one. So vacation buy sell is a funny thing. And it was challenging moving to paid time off because of the vacation buy rules of when it gets used in the order of paid time off. So I'll explain a little bit, but ultimately people are allowed to sell or buy up to 5 days, so 1 week worth of time, and they do that during annual benefits enrollment. So our enrollment provider, who's currently Mercer, actually supports that, and they make that election during open enrollment. So it's a one-time-a-year election, and you do that for the following year. So if someone, let's say, sold 5 days of time, they get paid that sell in January. So it's a lump sum benefit. A lot of our tenured employees utilize that benefit. And they can do that after 5 years of service. So meaning we want people under 5 years to go ahead and take their paid time off. But once you reach that 5-year mark, you can sell off some time and take that lump sum benefit. On the buy side, you can also make that election. But if you say, let's say I bought 5 days, that's a payroll deduction. And we take that out per year. So we're paid bi-weekly, which means we take a 26th of that amount each paycheck. So they pay for that benefit throughout the year, and they get 5 additional PTO days. Now, because of the rules, that has to be used last in the order, meaning if you had any earned PTO time, then you would take that first, and then you could dip into your vacation buy time. It also means that at the end of the year, if there's vacation buy left, we will have to pay out that portion of that benefit because it cannot be carried over into the next year. So for instance, let's say I bought 5 days and I had 10 days of paid time off total left at the end of the year. I get paid out for my 5 buy days, and then I'd be able to carry over the rest of the 5 that weren't time I had purchased. So kind of tricky on the rules there to kind of get around it with paid time off. A little easier when we were under the vacation policy, but still works pretty well. And definitely we weren't ready for a change in that benefit since we were already accustomed to it.
Good, that's very helpful. So we have another question about your paid family leave. Is that in addition to the statutory 12 weeks of FMLA?
So not in addition, it runs concurrently. So FMLA will just provide the job protection. The paid family leave is how we would pay people during that time. So not the easiest, it's only the easiest because I've had multiple kids at the company, but like, let's say I went out on maternity leave. So that's a short-term disability claim. I'd probably get paid for short-term disability for the 6 weeks that my doctor had me out to recover from the childbirth. Then I could use my paid family leave, which would get me from week 6 to 10. So that would be that 4 weeks of pay time, meaning that 10 weeks that I'm out with my child would all be paid, but all fall under FMLA as the job protection. So all runs concurrently, but it does provide that pay benefit for when I'm out. Good question.
So then let me ask you this then, because I'm looking at your current slide. So you currently do 12 weeks of short-term disability at 100% pay. So if we talk about something that's not childbirth, so if it's something that I have an unfortunate injury or illness and I have to be out for 15 weeks, then the first 12 I'm getting paid at 100% from short-term disability. Is that correct?
Yeah, after a 1 week waiting period. So if you had frozen sick time right now, we'd use that week 1. Okay. And then weeks basically 2 through 13 would be STD pay at 100%. And then weeks 14 to 26 would be that 75% pay. unless I had frozen sick time and I'd use that instead. Gets really tricky, right? I mean, administering that a little bit, and which is why only our leave administrator enters that time right now for short-term disability. So like as a manager, I couldn't put in that sick time for my employee. Basically, she would do that in that order. We would default, we would say sick time week 1, short-term disability, and then sick time or reduced short-term disability pay.
So then I heard you say 26 weeks. I'm assuming, is that how long your short-term disability goes until long-term kicks in?
Exactly. So then while they were out, they would do the things they needed to apply for long-term disability to see if they'd qualify.
So then once their FMLA runs up after 12 weeks, if they have bona fide medical records to say they still need to stay out, you all grant that leave, correct?
We do.
Which we all should, but yes. Okay.
Yeah. It's still a tricky conversation with the manager, right? Because they're like, well, they're not under FMLA anymore. But we honor that leave while they're out. And then when they come back, we go through, if they need to, the ADA interactive process, or we have procedures too for if they're in a safety sensitive position and if they need a return to work physical or a drug screening, that type of thing.
Okay. So one of the questions came in at, so you get 12 weeks on top of your PTO days, and I'm assuming that's the 12 weeks that they're asking about the short-term disability. I assume that's yes.
It is.
Okay. And then does your paid FMLA include intermittent leave?
No. So paid family leave, the way we designed it is that you use it consecutively, and you can only use it 2 times in a 5-year period. Meaning if you cared for a mom this year, right, that was maybe ill, and then you used it next year for maternity leave, that benefit would be exhausted until you reached the 5-year period. So we said it had to be consecutive, and that was just the paid family leave portion. Intermittent leave, the only difference we did for this year, we are letting people use that sick time if it is for personal illness or injury. Meaning if you take intermittent leave to care for a dependent, you wouldn't have normally been able to take your sick time anyways, because it was only for you. But we do allow it for you if it's intermittent leave.
Okay. Okay. And then what happens in situations where someone was advanced PTO, but then terminated before they accrued it?
It's a great question. So that's happened. And a lot of managers, we at this point have not taken the stance to recoup it on a final paycheck. So we're almost forgiving that accelerated earned benefit. Now we could get to next year, right, and revisit how often that's happening. But at this point, that's been the company's stance, is that we have the option to recoup it in the final paycheck, but we have not.
Okay. And so then are they still, speaking of final paycheck, if you get to, if I terminate today and I have 25 PTO days, are those paid out days? Do you I guess not, because you've not earned them all, but do you pay out earn unused vacation time or PTO days?
Yeah, we pay out earned, but just earned. So if I left July 1, I probably would have accumulated 12 and a half days. If I hadn't used any of them, then they would be paid out.
Okay. Okay.
But I like to use my days, so I wouldn't be in that situation.
I wouldn't either.
I try to spread mine out throughout the year. It makes for a happier Jen at work.
Yes, I get that. These have been really, really good questions. Do you guys have any more?
I have one. Can you talk through how you use the outside consulting groups that you mentioned in your presentation? Were there white papers? Did you actually bring consultants on site to look at your policies? How did you approach that?
Yeah, so we started just by asking them what sort of benchmarking detail they had, and we needed it pretty specific because we wanted to look at the retail branch and at just general market. And so they have a lot of that detail. So I'm pulling up, this is in my appendix, but sort of how we did it. And so for instance, the core design, we received general industry data. And in this version, it was provided by Mercer, and then at the 50th percentile. So a lot of it is very detailed, right? To say like, at what percentile you want to offer the benefits. But then even Willis Towers Watson provided similar benchmarking data, and they even will do it by tenure. They will include company holidays. And so they have really robust information that they just provided just as being our partners. But so really didn't even have to have anyone on site, where our group could just say, okay, give us this data, and we're able to take a look at it and kind of analyze it internally to see if, how we fall. Very similarly on the retail side, they had retail data that displayed, how much time off was for them. So one interesting thing you'll see on our 1 year of service for retail, we ended up going with 10 days as opposed to the 15 days. And that was mainly because before they had 0. So we just weren't ready to go from 0 to 15. And so at some point we could consider enhancing that benefit, but still an enhancement over 0. So that was kind of our thought process there. But no, beyond that, we didn't really have to have them on site. Most of it was just all virtual and through email requests and stuff. A great question.
So another question is, do you limit same day off requests to a certain number?
So each department has, that's a great one. So each department has different attendance policies. And so for instance, that the answer in our call center, so we have about, I don't know the number now, 150 people that sit in the call center in Lexington. They are very regimented on their attendance policy to say how many people could be off on a day, because they have to fulfill calls, and those are either calls from stores, right? When you call it an instant oil change store, you actually get to our call center. It's also calls for HR, it's calls for 1-800-Valvoline. So they're very staffed there. In the plants, very similar attendance policy, and they actually go through a bidding process based on tenure to request weeks off at the beginning of the year. I kind of think of that similar to like what our nurses and doctors do. If you've got any in the family, right, they go through and they bid basically for which weeks or holidays they want to be off. But let's say like for my group, if I had 2 people out at the same time, that wouldn't impact business. We could cover for them in a week period. I think it's where we're getting beyond a week. So we don't have a formal policy for, let's say, my group. But if I had 2 people wanting to take 2 consecutive weeks off, then we'd probably have to talk about it. That's at least my personal threshold, right? Is anything over a week is when I start to get like nervous about volume. But that's just me personally. So no corporate attendance policy. But certainly in all of our FAQs, we did mention, like, unless you have a department specific attendance policy, in that case, those would be enforced.
Okay, thank you.
Great question.
Any other questions or comments? This has been a great interactive conversation.
Yeah, I love all the questions. See, and that way you guys are all just ready to come join Valvoline. We're probably not at the same time.
So here's another question. If someone calls in absent, do you automatically use PTO?
Yeah, we've had that question before too. And we use PTO before unpaid. So that's if they have the time available, then it goes through paid time off. And that almost happens automatically in the system when we enter that day. Similarly, if you didn't have that PTO available, it automatically goes to unpaid if you had overextended your earned and allowable borrow. So, I can borrow 2 weeks in advance. If I wanted to take that 3rd week and I hadn't earned that time, I would go unpaid as well. It's a little tricky for exempt employees, but we have to monitor that too.
Okay. And so I'm assuming, or do you have any sort of policy that you have? Does this fall into the department attendance policies that if you have so many unexcused PTO requests that's a disciplinary action, or is that a company policy? How's that approach?
It is actually a department at this point. For instance, plant locations have, if you 3 days, no call, no show, no job. So that's at a department level.
Okay. Any other questions? No. Well, if you have any others, certainly share those with us in the chat as we kind of wrap up here, or you're welcome to email myself, Meredith, or Autumn. And if you didn't have a chance to ask it today, we can certainly ask Jen after the fact if you have a question. And yes, we will be providing a copy of the presentation, assuming Jen, you don't mind, right?
No, I don't at all.
Perfect. So yes, we will have a copy of the presentation sent to all the attendees today. Thank you, Jen. This was super informative. I know that so many of us are continually looking at our time off policies to think, are we within benchmark? Do we need to change? Do we need to update? So as robust as Valvoline is, this was a great example for us to be mimicking. We did have one other question that just came in. Do you require that they take the PTO in certain increments, i.e. 1 hour or 4 hours or 15 minutes?
We recommend right now 15.
Okay.
The system would actually let you do less. It just gets a little tedious to track. So it's not like formally stated within our policy that it has to be 15, but that's our recommendation.
Okay. Okay. Perfect. Okay. There again, thank you so much for all of your questions. This was a very, very interactive conversation, which we think is a great change from just having someone present. So thank you, Jen. The information was very valuable, I know, to me, and I'm sure by the amount of questions, I think it was to everyone. So thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate this. I think we can all learn from this. So as I mentioned in the beginning, if you have interest or wants for future topics, definitely let us know, because we want to continue providing content that is of interest to everyone. So I know we're all kind of different, varying